And so finally I jumped in and I said, I don't know if you all have paid attention, but the Jesus story is quite more often than not about his embrace of those who were alienated and ostracized and put out and put upon and called sinner by the establishment. And man, they came for me like nobody's business.
Hello, friends, and thank you for joining me for this week's episode of the Mission Podcast. Joining me on the show today is the author of Better Waking Up to Who We Could Be, Melvin Bray. Melvin and I had an absolutely amazing conversation, and he takes us on quite a journey. As you know, I love to squeeze every ounce out of our guests that we can, just so I can provide the best content I can for you all. So I really hope you enjoy this discussion. Melvin's book, Better Waking Up to Who We Could Be, is available now. I'll make sure to put links to that in the show notes, but for now, let's jump right in. Well, welcome, friends. Thank you for joining me for this conversation with Melvin Bray. Melvin, thanks so much for joining me today.
It is my pleasure, Ryan.
I'm looking forward to getting to know you. I read your bio. I've read some things about you. It says some really great things. You are.
Don't believe half of what you read.
Oh well, I'm gonna believe. I'm gonna believe this. I'm gonna believe this first part where you're talking about committed father, devoted husband, learner, teacher, writer, storyteller, lover of people. I really get that from your side. Yeah, all that still holds true. So, you're someone who has invested your life deeply into helping other people. Some people call that ministry. Some people call that just being a good person. But your life really revolves around helping people become a better version of themselves, which, we're going to talk about your book, Better Waking Up to Who We Could Be. But I'd love to kick off our conversation right now because a lot of the work that you do is with young people. So as someone who takes a role in, we're in a time right now where working with youth is it's tricky. There's a lot of ways because to engage youth in a way that is sustainable is something that takes a little bit of imagination. It takes a little bit of creativity. So how has your youth mentoring skills? How have you seen yourself sort of evolve over the years to meet the meeting needs of youth that you're encountering when you step into a space to mentor?
Okay. For 20 years of my life, I was an educator, a classroom educator. Oh, wow. And I did work with, I did also work with youth in informal settings, beginning years ago with the Boys and Girls Club, and then spending some time with Young Life, which was more of a Christian space and so on and so forth. And so now most of my energy and focus goes into my own kids and then their friends. So how has that evolved? It's interesting, right? I spent many years using as a way into mentorship and youth development work, a sustainability model where I actually had kids gardening and putting their hands in the ground, feeling the dirt, learning about the rhythms of life.
Yeah.
And one of the important reasons why was because for me, it was the precursor work to justice work. So how do you, and so most of my metaphors around this come from that gardening time, right? Like, how do you prepare the soil?
Right.
For the thing it is that you want to plant and you want to see grow. And then what aspects of that do you have control over, and what aspects of that do you not have any control over whatsoever? And so what's interesting is, like, when you plant a seed, it doesn't matter how big or small. Everything about that plant almost is embedded in that seed.
Yeah.
Like it's just nascent.
Mm-hmm.
And then what happens is that, the outside environment acts on it and calls forth the thing that is in that seed, but it doesn't change the nature of what's in that seed. And even if, I've seen trees and plants that grow in the oddest sorts of ways that are very different than how plants normally grow, because they have to accommodate what's in their environment. But still, even though it's growing in directions, it still is essentially itself. And so one of the things that I've learned over the years is how true that is. So that I may not have been able to articulate it or understand it or say, this is something I know. Mm-hmm. But much of what I learned I've learned over time in my adult life about working with youth is just an affirmation of what was handed to me when I first got into the work, what the youth I was working with were saying to me then that I thought I knew better or didn't want to believe.
Yeah.
And it has just borne itself out and proven itself to be true. And so one simple example of that, back when I was in my early 20s, I used to take kids to camp, and it doesn't really matter what camp, right? I just love camp.
Yeah.
And I used to take kids to camp, and to a person, everyone I took for free always got kicked out.
Wow.
To a person.
100%.
Everyone I took for free got kicked out. Everyone who worked on the front end and invested in their own participation, right? Like valued the thing. Mm-hmm. Then was made something of it, whatever it was. And so, what that taught me over time, even though I couldn't articulate it then, is that people value what they invest in.
Yeah.
Now, what's important to understand about that for some people that may reinforce certain kind of very conservative ideas about how what they use language like handouts and so on and so forth, right? That's not really what that's about. Mm-hmm. What that's about is that understanding what the investment is that makes a thing valuable is what's important.
Yep.
Not predetermining what the investment should be and then making everyone pay it, right? Yeah. But understanding what the investment is that makes any specific thing valuable to any specific person. And it's not going to be different every single person, but it's going to be different based on the context out of which certain people come.
Yeah.
And so, those are the kinds of things I've learned over the years. And that's one of the ones that has proven true and still impacts the work I do with my own children and their friends.
Well, I mean, there's so many things in there when you talk about youth, and there's a wonderful metaphor between youth and a seed,
Yeah.
And you talk something about how, you have an identity, but you still grow and you do things in different directions. And I think really when you think about youth, that's probably one of their biggest challenges. One of the things that I've learned from reading like Richard Rohr and other folks like that, or they talk about this idea of mirroring. And one of the important aspects for young people when they're bringing ideas to people and when they're kind of sorting out their identity is to have someone who can in a healthy way mirror and sort of affirm how they're growing and what they're seeing, but doing so in a way that like you said is very special. It's not a process. There's not just like okay, we've got a new person coming in, so this is how we handle it, but you learn about the person, you learn about their backstory, you learn about their perspective, you learn about where they came from, and then you can then learn more about them as they grow. But it's that relational piece first, and I think that's tricky. That's tricky with kids, especially nowadays. I don't think there's a real trust especially when in terms of creativity. I for a short time worked as a career advisor for an art school, and I remember that there was just an awful lot of fear that a lot of my students would talk to me about, pursuing their career, the work that they do. do, the ideas that they have. There was just a lot of fear of rejection,
Mm-hmm.
and so mentoring doesn't, I learned through my mentoring that mentoring doesn't mean you have to just tell people what they want to hear, but you give people news that's helpful and that helps them change and that will help them grow. So as someone now who you have kids and you have their friends and I'm sure they're busy in a lot of things. The new generation, they see things differently. They have a lot of media at their attention. Their attention span is really it's brought in a lot by technology and things like that.
Yeah.
How do you help kids balance? Because I think I'm old enough. I'm 35. I'm old enough to know the value of turning off technology and just engaging in people. So how do you help, with people that you've mentored and with your kids? How do you help hold that balance of creating actual physical relationships and then helping them do what's important to them, and that's sustaining their relationships online as well?
Yeah, that's a really important question. Like, so. And I'm not sure balance is the way in. Like we like language of balance for good reason. So I don't mean to undermine the assumption that's there, but I think one of the things I've learned over the years is that there's no success outside of relationship.
Yeah.
Period. Like you can't even be alone successfully without the enough relationship to leverage where folk will leave you be.
Yeah.
right. Like otherwise folk are always interrupting you, always doing this, that, and the other thing. And then, beyond that, like there are times when you should be interrupted. Mm-hmm. I took a year, 2012, to write Better, the bulk of Better. Mm-hmm. And the only way I was able to do that successfully is that every Sunday, my family would allow me to sit out on the front porch and write uninterrupted. Mm. Every Sunday, I got to put in 4 to 8 hours of that year. So that's why 80% of it was done that year. The thing is, that was predicated on me giving my children enough face time during the week.
Yeah.
In the midst of working, right, to where they didn't feel like this was a loss. Same thing true in my relationship with my wife, right? Like we had to make sure we guarded our time during the course of that week. But even beyond that, it also was predicated on the right of my kids to wander out on the front porch periodically.
Yeah.
Knowing that I was going to pause. And me having the good sense to pause,
right, and engage in them in that moment,
engage them in that moment, and know that moment wasn't a sacrifice of the entire day. It was probably all of 5 minutes or less, and then they were off to doing something else. And so to have children, for my children to know that even though we're supposed to give daddy this time, that they had that right, that whatever was important to so. That notion that everything is all success is predicated on the strength of relationship. So how does that apply to the question you were asking? You have to do the work to build the relationship on the terms that the people you're dealing with value, mm-hmm. so that then you can ask them, hey, come away from that there. And let's attend to this together, and they'll value it.
Right.
Right. Like because kids don't value the thing, they value the person.
Yeah, that's a great observation.
Right. Yeah. Like they value the person. And if you value them, somebody once said in some training I once took that kids don't care, young people don't care what you know until they know that you care. Mm. Right. Yeah. And so if they're convinced, I mean, that's exactly it. Right. Like if they're convinced of that care, then they'll care enough. They might do all this back and forth and shrugging their shoulders and sighing and all this other stuff about this thing that you want to draw them into for a while. But ultimately, the reason you can do that is because you've spent that time, put in that time, investing in the ways that they understand investment. When I worked with Young Life, the one thing they used to say, man, show up.
Yeah.
Show up. Where kids are, you be.